No one can predict what continued fighting and insecurity bring. Be clear. What is certain is that the risk of ascend into a widening civil war is only too real. That would bring about a humanitarian catastrophe and consume the future of such an important country. The political repercussions of intensifying violence in the wider region would be immense, compounding the many crises besetting the Horn of Africa. Just in northern Ethiopia today, more than 7 million people need humanitarian assistance. Efforts to mobilize assistance in Tigray, where more than 5 million people need food, and an estimated 400,000 people are living in famine-like conditions, continue to be undermined by an inability to move cash, fuel, and supplies into the region. No airstrikes have reached Mekelle since 18 October amid continued airstrikes. United Nations humanitarian air service flights have remained suspended since airstrikes on 22 October forced a flight to return to Addis Ababa. We've been unable to move fuel into Tigray since August. While some emergency supplies have been moved, it has been 4 months since the last major shipment of medicines and health supplies to Tigray. Lack of core life-saving activities, including water trucking, food distributions, mobile clinics, and support for acutely malnourished children and mothers. Needs and protection concerns are also rapidly escalating in the Amhara and Afar regions, with large numbers of people fleeing from their homes as the fighting continues to expand. Let us recall that this expanding crisis is happening in a country that was already grappling with enormous humanitarian challenges, including local conflicts, flooding, drought, and infectious disease outbreaks. While needs are most acute in the north, across Ethiopia as a whole, more than 20 million people are estimated to need some form of humanitarian support, and more than 5 million people are internally displaced. Emergency Relief Coordinator Martin Griffiths traveled to Ethiopia over the weekend to review Ethiopia's increasing needs and plan for a greater humanitarian response should the fighting continue, as is feared. Unfettered access to conflict areas remains key. Mr. President, last week, the report of the joint OHCHR Ethiopian Human Rights Commission investigation into the conflict in Tigray, which covered the period between November 2020 and June 2021, shed light on the horrific suffering civilians have endured. The report includes that there are reasonable grounds to believe that all parties to the conflict, including the Ethiopian National Defense Force, Eritrean Defense Force, Amhara Special Forces, and allied militia on one side, and Tigrayan forces on the other, committed violations of international human rights, humanitarian, and refugee law, to include attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure, indiscriminate attacks resulting in civilian casualties, and extrajudicial killings, torture, arbitrary detentions, sexual and gender-based violence, and forced displacement. The report states that war crimes and crimes against humanity may have been committed. It also outlines steps that should be taken to ensure accountability for these acts. High Commissioner Bachelet highlighted in her remarks last week that incidents of serious human rights violations have continued. More recently, incidents of hate speech and targeting of ethnic groups have increased at an alarming rate. In this regard, the Security Council's call on 5 November for refraining from inflammatory speech and incitement to violence is welcome and timely. Mr. President, there must be an immediate cessation of hostilities. This has been the call of the Secretary General, African Union Commission Chair Faki, IGAD Executive Secretary Workna, the leader of Ethiopia's key neighbor, Kenya President Uhuru Kenyatta, and the UN Security Council. They've also called for negotiation of a lasting ceasefire and for the creation of conditions for an inclusive Ethiopian dialogue to resolve the crisis and create the foundation for peace and stability throughout the country. The Secretary General has been in frequent contact with Prime Minister Abiy, urging restraint and dialogue and offering his good offices. Further, the Secretary General has offered President Obasanjo the full support of the United Nations to his efforts to resolve the conflict. UN colleagues on the ground continue to urge all sides to this conflict to show restraint and provide unfettered access to vulnerable populations. Mr. President, the recently concluded elections in Ethiopia demonstrated the people's commitment to the democratic process. At the ceremony to mark his new mandate last month, Prime Minister Abiy spoke of his government's commitment to resolve the ongoing challenges and his intention to launch a national dialogue. The urgency for such an inclusive initiative has never been greater. In closing, let me stress that the UN is steadfastly committed to stay and deliver in Ethiopia in support of all the people of the country. We continue our work there, including thanks to the dedication of our Ethiopian national staff, who must be provided full protection by national authorities, regardless of their background. Ethiopia, a founding member of the United Nations, needs our support. We urge Ethiopians to come together to build a shared, prosperous future before it is too late. Thank you, Mr. President.
I would like to thank Ms. DiCarlo for her briefing. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Olusegun Obasanjo.
And Raymond Lafuente, President of the UN Security Council. Your Excellency Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, Excellencies, members of the Council, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, it is a great pleasure and honor for me to be invited to the briefing of this august body to discuss the situation in Ethiopia within the context of its agenda item, peace and security in Africa. I wish to express my heartfelt thanks and appreciation to the President and members of the Council for this invitation, which will allow me to exchange views on pertinent unfolding developments in one of the strategic countries of the continent of Africa. I also wish to thank the chairperson of the AU Commission for my nomination on the 26th of August, 2021 as the African Union High Representative for the Horn of Africa to intensify engagements with all relevant political actors and stakeholders towards promoting and entrenching durable peace and stability within the Horn of Africa, as well as support to AU-led strategies and diplomatic interventions in the region through the facilitation of inclusive political dialogue, reconciliation, and social cohesion processes. The appointment is a delicate one for two principal reasons. It is the first ever appointment by the AU of a high representative for an entire region. And the second reason is that each of the 8 countries of the region has a specific context. My assignment is part of the AU drive to promote peace, security, stability, and political dialogue all over the Horn of Africa region, and has allowed me to engage with most of the leaders of the region, relevant bilateral and multilateral partners, as well as key political actors and stakeholders, especially in Ethiopia. Apart from the region, I have also paid visits to Europe to meet with the President of the Republic of France and to Brussels to meet with the leaders of the European Union from 5th of October to 8th of October 2021. I have also traveled to the United States of America, where I met with the Secretary General of the United Nations and the Secretary of State of the United States of America from 9th to 14th October 2021. These initial visits offered me the opportunity to discuss with world leaders about the objective of the appointment, as well as to solicit their logistical and all other supports towards the implementation of my mandate. Since I began the assignment, I have briefed the AU Peace and Security Council on 2 occasions, the first of which was on the 28th of October 2021 on the region, and the second only this morning, specifically on the situation in Ethiopia. The Undersecretary has given us a little bit of the situation, the present situation in Ethiopia. Mr. President, it is pertinent to point out that the crisis situation in northern Ethiopia has continued to drastically deteriorate in recent weeks, leading to a serious escalation of the situation. I've been following these developments with keen attention, and it is owing to the rapid changes in trend that I am paying another visit here in Ethiopia to engage all stakeholders for the de-escalation of the situation. It should be noted that following days of report of intense fighting in the north of the country, the Ethiopian cabinet declared on the 2nd of November a nationwide state of emergency with immediate effect, while the central authority urging the citizens to prepare to defend the capital. The mass demonstration yesterday, 7th November, as well as other similar demonstrations in several cities in support of the federal government, is evident of the present reality. Distinguished members of the Council, since my arrival in Ethiopia on the 4th of November, after my visit to Sudan on a day earlier, I have met with the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, the President of Ethiopia, the President of Oromia, and had meaningful discussion with them on the ongoing escalation, with reflection on how to de-escalate tension and to pave the way for dialogue. During my meetings with the Prime Minister, we agreed that I pay a visit to Mekelle to meet the ground leaders. It is in this context that I traveled to Mekelle yesterday, 7th November, to engage the leaders of the northern region in an effort to de-escalate tension and to begin to find an amicable solution to the situation. As a summary to our discussions, all these leaders here in Addis Ababa and in the north agree individually that the difference between them are political and require political solution through dialogue. This therefore constitutes a window of opportunity that we can collectively tap into to assist the people of Ethiopia to find lasting solution to the ongoing crisis. It is, however, important to mention the window of opportunity we have is very little and that the time is short for any intervention in this regard. The ongoing conflict situation continues to have severe humanitarian consequences on the population, with huge impact on socioeconomic development and stability. The time is now for collective actions in finding lasting solutions to avoid further escalation of the situation, which may have direct effect on the strategic Horn of Africa region as a whole. Your Excellency, the President of the Council, please permit me, following the foregoing, to urge the Council to consider the following. One, strongly urge and encourage the federal government of Ethiopia and the Tigray People Liberation Front to engage in political dialogue without any preconditions. Two, call for an immediate and unconditional comprehensive ceasefire and cessation of hostilities by all parties. Three, call for immediate and unhindered humanitarian access. Four, call on the parties to ensure respect and compliance with international humanitarian and human rights laws and practice. Five, call for an immediate commencement of an all-inclusive national dialogue and reconciliation. And six, call on international community to rally behind the AU-led process in order to ensure coherence and unity of purpose for our peacemaking efforts in the Horn of Africa and particularly in Ethiopia. In the last 48 hours, Mr. President, as I said, I have visited Mekelle, capital of Tigray. I have consulted with the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, the President of Tigray, the President of Oromia region, and the President of the Republic of Ethiopia. I've also consulted with the chairperson of AU Commission. Tomorrow, I will be paying a visit to Amhara region and Afar region, all in effort to harmonize the views of the leaders in the area of withdrawal of troops from regions that are not theirs, and also in maintaining humanitarian access. All these, I believe, are very important, and they are the areas of priority that most of the leaders that I have consulted with have indicated. And I hope that with the efforts we have in hand, before the end of this week, we hope to have a program in hand that will indicate how we can get the humanitarian and withdrawal of troops all put together to meet the immediate demand of the stakeholders. Thank you very much, Mr. President, for listening to me.
I thank Mr. Obasanjo for his briefing. I will now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of Ireland.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. And I want to start by thanking Under Secretary General De Carlo, and in particular, you, High Representative Obasanjo, for your really important briefings. In the context of what we've just heard and the excellent work that the High Representative is already doing, despite the uncertainties we heard from Under Secretary General De Carlo, we want to believe that we may just be beginning to see possible pathways emerge for an end to this crisis. We certainly share the view that we dare not miss the window of opportunity for peace. That's why when I consider this conflict, my abiding feelings are of shame and frustration. Shame because as a council, we around this table have stood by as this crisis has intensified over the past year, causing immeasurable suffering for millions of Ethiopians. Frustration because the Council's voice matters on this issue and it has the power to deliver change. We remained silent for too long. But today I want to commend our African colleagues with whom we worked to gain agreement at last on a Council statement last Friday, a Council statement that calls squarely for an immediate ceasefire. That African leadership in New York is also manifest at African Union headquarters, where we saw the African Union PSC meet just today, and importantly also on the ground where it matters most to the people of Ethiopia. We depend on regional leaders, in particular on you, High Representative Obasanjo. We rely on regional organizations, including IGAD, which have a crucial role to play in engaging with all sides, supporting mediation efforts, and ultimately assisting Ethiopia to find a solution to this crisis. We welcome the efforts that are taking place as we speak. We call on everyone in Ethiopia to embrace this opportunity. Time is of the essence. Your people are putting their faith in you. For the good of your country, the fighting needs to stop. The talking needs to start. We are 1 year on from the beginning of this crisis. Today, we must ask ourselves if we as this Council have done enough to prevent catastrophe, a catastrophe that is causing untold harm to the people of Ethiopia. As each month passes, we have seen the situation deteriorate. For the ordinary people of Ethiopia, their futures are being stripped away. As we heard last week from the OHCHR and the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, there have been shocking human rights abuses committed during this conflict. Women, men, and children have been raped in horrific fashion. And let me be clear, civilians have borne the brunt of the violence. International humanitarian law and human rights norms have been cast aside. Meanwhile, vital, life-saving aid has been blocked from reaching starving and sick people. In recent days, the situation has become even more grave. Humanitarian operations across northern Ethiopia have effectively ground to a halt. Military operations have escalated. A state of emergency has been declared, suspending the basic rights of Ethiopian citizens. More people have been displaced, lives and livelihoods have been lost. We've also witnessed increasingly shocking incidences of hate speech and dehumanizing language that risk inciting the worst type of violence against individuals or groups within Ethiopian society. We simply cannot stand by and allow this to continue. Too many lives are at stake. Meanwhile, continued military actions and mobilization now threaten the very stability and territorial integrity which are vital for Ethiopia and for the region. Today, our messages are to all parties. Today, our messages are clear and simple. First, it's paramount that all parties must immediately facilitate the provision of life-saving humanitarian aid to those who desperately need it in line with international humanitarian law. Second, we need an immediate end to the fighting. Civilians must be protected. Third, we need all parties to the conflict to embrace negotiations towards a lasting political solution. Fourth, the chilling hate speech, dehumanizing language, and incitement to violence must end. Accountability is imperative. Fifth, we need an inclusive and Ethiopian-led national dialogue that includes all regions and stakeholders. We cannot wait any longer to act on these 5 important steps. Mr. President, Ethiopia has been an inspiring example of peace and stability in Africa. Ireland's relationship with Ethiopia is one of our oldest and closest on the African continent. We remain deeply committed to supporting Ethiopia and its people. It is also shocking and tragic that the entire country now risks being overrun by violence and conflict. This unnecessary war must end now. All sides in Ethiopia must turn the tide towards peace and now steer the country back to where the people of Ethiopia deserve to be, on a hopeful pathway to peace. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Ireland for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Tunisia.
Thank you, Mr. President. I take the floor on behalf of the A3+1, namely Kenya, Niger, Tunisia, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines, on the developing situation in Ethiopia. I wish to express our sincere condolences to the government and people of Niger for the heinous terrorist attack that took place recently in the country. I thank His Excellency President Obasanjo, the African Union High Representative for the Horn of Africa, and Under-Secretary General for Political and Peace-Building Affairs, Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo, for their insightful presentations. We thank President Obasanjo for his extensive efforts within the African Union-led process, and we welcome in this regard the communique of the African Union Peace and Security Council issued today on the situation in Ethiopia. I also welcome the participation of the permanent representative of Ethiopia. Mr. President, 1 month after our last meeting, the situation in Ethiopia continues to deteriorate dangerously, especially during the last 2 weeks, bringing the sister nation every day closer to a full-scale civil war, which, if not stopped immediately, could result to unprecedented violence and widespread atrocities and threaten the unity and territorial integrity of Ethiopia, with the potential to occasion destabilizing effects in the wider region. The A3+1 is deeply concerned over the escalation of military confrontation in northern Ethiopia and its expansion to the Amhara and Afar regions, as well as about its impacts on the humanitarian front. Once more, we highlight that the priority at this stage is to achieve an immediate ceasefire, which is crucial to allow for an unrestricted humanitarian access to the affected communities, as well as for the re-establishment of public services in all the conflict areas. We therefore call for the immediate cessation of hostilities, the full respect for the life and property of civilians, as well as state infrastructure, and urge the parties to the conflict to constructively engage in discussions to seek a peaceful solution and pave the way for an inclusive Ethiopian-led dialogue and to national reconciliation in the interests of the country. At the same time, we remind all parties that they should respect their obligations under international humanitarian law and human rights law, with particular regard to the protection of civilians, which requires all parties to urge their supporters to abstain from acts of reprisal against any community and refrain from hate speech and incitement to violence and divisiveness, as stated by the chairman of the African Union Commission on November the 3rd. All Ethiopians are one people. As A3+1, we urge all Ethiopians to embrace one another and to refuse to be pitted against one another on account of ethnic, religious, or other identities. Mr. President, today, peace and security in the Horn of Africa is at risk. The lives of millions of men and women and children are at stake, and we have a huge and historic responsibility to prevent large-scale atrocities and famine, and to forestall possible destabilization of the region. Today, we have a strong need for diplomacy and for mediation. We welcome the initiatives of the United Nations Secretary General and all international partners and regional leaders to find a peaceful solution to this crisis. We believe that it is important today that we speak with one voice and send a clear and united message to all parties in Ethiopia that violence is not an option to resolving the political disputes, however serious they may be. We have witnessed during the last year how violence led to loss of thousands of lives and millions of displaced persons, the human rights violations and atrocities, and to a dire humanitarian situation. We are left with the question, how much longer and how many more innocent Ethiopians must perish before all parties can understand that there can be no military solution to this crisis? Ethiopia, this great nation and cradle of civilization, which has been an anchor of regional peace and stability, deserves that we stand with its people in these trying times. In this regard, we believe that the African Union and the neighboring countries have a major role to play to help Ethiopians find their way to peace and stability through political dialogue and reconciliation. We should help them unite again under the common interest of their country. We reiterate our full support to the African Union High Representative for the Horn of Africa, His Excellency President Obasanjo, and commend his mediation efforts to achieve a ceasefire and a prompt and peaceful resolution of the conflict. We call on all stakeholders and international partners to extend every possible support to President Obasanjo in his highly important mission, cognizant of the importance of coordinated action. In conclusion, Mr. President, we, the A3+1, reaffirm our respect for and commitment to the sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity of Ethiopia. We stand on solidarity with our brothers and sisters in Ethiopia through these trying times in their pursuit for peace and stability. I thank you.
Agradezco.
I thank the representative of Tunisia for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Norway.
Thank you, President. And thank you to A3+1 and Ireland for leading the call to add this item to our agenda. This is indeed a time when a strong and united message from the Council is critical. And thank you to USG Di Carlo and the AU High Representative for the Horn of Africa for their brief, and not least the efforts by the AU. The development of the crisis in Ethiopia is threatening the stability and the very integrity of the country. It's hitting the civilian population hard, and certainly the most vulnerable the hardest. As a close friend and decade-long partner to Ethiopia and the Ethiopian people, Norway is deeply concerned, both by the magnitude of the crisis and its potential regional impact. There can be no military solution. This should be evident to all parties, from the federal government to the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front and the Oromo Liberation Army. Further escalation of fighting will not lead to victory. It will only inflict more unnecessary suffering on the Ethiopian people. We are deeply concerned by reports of increased ethnic profiling and discrimination. Ethnically charged statements inciting violence will only deepen divisions, perhaps to irreversible levels. Divisive actions today make peace more difficult tomorrow. We urge Ethiopian leaders to already recognize the need for a future inclusive dialogue and reconciliation process. President, all parties must exercise maximum restraint and immediately work to de-escalate the conflict. We specifically call on the TDF, the TPLF, and forces from the Oromo Liberation Army not to attempt an attack on Addis Ababa. We also urge the government of Ethiopia to refrain from imposing any measures or restrictions upon civilians of specific ethnicities, including Tigray and Oromo. Norway fully supports the AU Peace Initiative and the mandate and efforts of the AU High Representative for the Horn of Africa. We call on all parties to fully cooperate with the High Representative to immediately stop fighting and make the necessary concessions for a negotiated cessation of hostilities. President, the humanitarian situation is extremely dire. Hundreds of thousands in Tigray are facing famine-like conditions, and there is a serious risk of large-scale famine. At least 2 million persons are displaced in Tigray and hundreds and thousands in Amara and Afar. Access to food, health care, and other basic services must be restored, and all possible modalities for this must be explored. We call on all parties to immediately facilitate full, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access. We know that the suffering of the Ethiopian people also go beyond the current humanitarian crisis. Norway is appalled by the findings in the joint report by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission. While limited in time and geographical scope, it outlines a pattern of the killing of civilians and the widespread and systematic use of sexual and gender-based violence. The obligation of all are made clear. Incidents must be investigated and perpetrators brought to justice. All parties to the conflicts must fully respect international human rights and international humanitarian law, even in the most dire circumstances. President, every day that the fighting continues and that the rhetoric grows only makes a credible accountability process and a viable transitional justice mechanism more vital. These mechanisms will be of utmost importance to future national reconciliation. The people of Ethiopia, indeed all people in the broader region, are dependent on the ability of the parties to urgently find a path to sustainable peace, and we stand ready to assist. Thank you.
Agradezco.
I thank the representative of Norway for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Vietnam.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I would like to thank USG Di Carlo
and the High Representative, the Chairperson of the African Union Commission, Obasanjo, for their insightful briefings. I welcome the ambassadors, permanent representative of Ethiopia, to our meeting today. Mr. President, we are deeply concerned about the deteriorating situation in Ethiopia, especially the continued fighting and expansions of combat and hostility in and around Tigray, Amhara, and Afar regions over the weekend. The sharp escalation of military operation and clashes in the last few weeks have plunged Ethiopia and the region into a more serious level of instabilities, pushing the party to a point of no return. These developments have also brought about consequences and adverse impact on the daily lives of millions of people while hindering humanitarian activities. We therefore urge all parties to end hostility immediately and start an inclusive Ethiopian national dialogue toward a immediate and unconditional ceasefire and make it sustainable one. Only with sustainable ceasefire can the primary condition for a credible and inclusive dialogue be established to find a political settlement to the long-lasting political grievances that have led to the conflict. Mr. President, the escalating hostility threatened to worsen the already dire humanitarian situation in Tigray, Amhara, and Afar, where millions of people are in need of urgent humanitarian assistance. As reported, 5.2 million people, especially those 400,000 people who live in famine-like conditions, are having to rely on food aid every day. We welcome progress in the practical activities carried out by the United Nations, humanitarian organizations, and international and regional partners to help Ethiopian, including people in Tigray, over the past few months. We also welcome the visit made by the USG Martin Griffiths and the African Union envoy to the Horn of Africa, Obasanjo, to the northern Tigray region of Ethiopia on Sunday to discuss humanitarian access and a possible ceasefire. However, we understand that the access to and distribution of humanitarian assistance remains far from satisfying the urgent needs of people in this region. We therefore call for an immediate removal of restriction and creation of a favorable condition to humanitarian access, full observation of international humanitarian law, and rapid restoration of public services and upscaling humanitarian assistance. All measures must be taken to protect civilians and humanitarian workers. Mr. President, as we stated previously, the crisis in Tigray stems from the complicated political, historical, and ethnic reasons. Therefore, rather than invoking further hatreds, relevant parties must give the highest priority to the interest of their people, and therefore patiently engage in dialogue and reconciliation. It is high time for a compromise to be made toward a comprehensive solution for sustained stability and development of Ethiopia on the basis of respecting principles of international laws and the UN Charter. Without a constructive dialogue in place, further bloodshed and confrontational rhetoric will drive parties further apart and block the path of peace. Dialogue should be started right now. Otherwise, it would be too late to save Ethiopia from a catastrophe. In this process, the international community should support all efforts toward the end, including through a swift and effective action, while being full respect of independence, sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity of Ethiopia. Mr. President, the conflict and situation in Tigray have had certain impact on the region and thus requires all parties to exercise self-restraint. The principle of non-interference in the internal affairs of the state and settlement dispute by peaceful means should be constantly upheld. In this connection, we support the role of the High Representative of the African Union for the Horn of African regions and his effort to have bring about a ceasefire and a prompt and peaceful resolution to the conflict. We also support the constructive engagement of neighboring countries and regional organizations, especially the African Union, for the sake of peace, stability, security, and national reconciliation, national unity, and development in Ethiopia. I thank you, Mr. President.
Agradezco.
I thank the representative of Vietnam for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of China.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I wish to thank Under Secretary General De Carlo and AU High Representative for the Horn of Africa, Mr. Obasanjo, for their briefings. I welcome Ambassador Amta, Permanent Representative of Ethiopia, to our meeting today. Lately, the situation in Ethiopia has deteriorated. The escalation and spread of the conflicts have resulted in rising civilian casualties and a worsening humanitarian situation. The AU and leaders of regional countries have all expressed their concerns. As a good friend of the people of Ethiopia, China sincerely hopes that all relevant parties will put the interests of the country and its people first, keep calm and exercise restraint to avoid further escalation of the situation. At the same time, we hope they will commit to resolving conflicts and differences through political dialogue in order to create conditions for peace and reconciliation. The Council issued a press statement last Friday on the situation in Ethiopia, calling for a ceasefire, calling for a cessation of hostilities and the commencement of political dialogue. We hope all the relevant parties will respond positively. The current situation in Ethiopia is the result of a combination of political, historical, ethnic, and other factors, the solutions of which can only be found from within. Regional countries and regional organizations know the best about the historical background and the present challenges in Ethiopia, and therefore can play a leading role in the political settlement of the Ethiopian issue. China always supports African solutions to African problems. We welcome the good offices, the political good offices of High Representative Obasanjo. We call on all parties concerned and regional countries to provide full support to the High Representative in his work. Likewise, we also welcome the offer of good offices that Secretary General Guterres made to Ethiopia and expect enhanced coordination between the UN and the AU so they can work in concert to play a constructive role in promoting nationwide peace and reconciliation in Ethiopia. The international community, in particular the Security Council, should give the time and space needed for the AU and others to carry out their good offices. Using trade restrictions or cutting off aid as a means to exert maximum pressure on Ethiopia will only interfere with the political settlement, but will not help the parties resolve their conflicts and rebuild mutual trust. The current humanitarian needs in Ethiopia are enormous. The international community should help Ethiopia improve its humanitarian response capacity and scale up the relief delivery so that humanitarian assistance can, to the maximum extent possible, reach everyone in need. When providing humanitarian support to Ethiopia, we should respect the country's sovereignty and leadership, follow the UN guiding principles for humanitarian actions, and avoid politicizing humanitarian issues. All parties concerned in Ethiopia should fulfill their obligations under the international humanitarian law, protect the safety and security of civilians, foreign nationals included, facilitate humanitarian relief operations, and prevent further deterioration of the humanitarian situation. Ethiopia is a country with a long history and a splendid civilization. At every historical juncture, the people of Ethiopia have been able to come together to defend the country's sovereignty, unity, and long-term development. We are confident that the people of Ethiopia have the capacity and wisdom to overcome the current challenges, maintain national unity, and move the country back to the right track of peace, stability, development, and revitalization. China stands ready to work with the international community to continue to support the efforts of the people of Ethiopia. Thank you, Mr. President.
Agradezco.
I would like to thank the representative of China for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank High Representative Obasanjo and Under Secretary General Di Carlo for their important briefings. I also thank the A3+1 and Ireland for calling today's meeting and for their work on Friday's statement for this Council. The United Kingdom shares the serious concerns already expressed today about the situation in Ethiopia, including from the African Union Peace and Security Council. The introduction of a state of emergency by the government of Ethiopia must not be used as an excuse to ignore human rights and international humanitarian law. Violations and abuses of human rights, international humanitarian law, and refugee law are already taking place as a result of this conflict. The report released last week by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission documented these in detail, including the widespread use of sexual violence as a weapon of war, torture, attacks on civilians, and forced displacement. All parties should act to implement the recommendations contained in that joint report, ensure accountability and prevent further suffering. Indeed, addressing the humanitarian and human impact of this tragic conflict should be our immediate focus. And when it is over, we must come together and help Ethiopia heal. Therefore, it's vital that all parties stop fighting and start talking. Tigrayan forces need to stop their advances and return to Tigray. The humanitarian blockade needs to be lifted. Hate speech and ethnic profiling must end. It serves only to set Ethiopian against Ethiopian and deepens divisions which will make recovery from this crisis even harder. The United Kingdom gives its full support to the Secretary General and His Excellency African Union Special Envoy Obasanjo and urges all parties to make use of their good offices. We stand ready to provide any support that is required. Mr. President, in the last year, this conflict has brought only destruction, suffering, and despair. It is past time for all parties to put the Ethiopian people first. Thank you.
Agradezco.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President, I thank President Obasanjo and Ms. DiCarlo for their statements. I will emphasize 3 points. Immediate decisions are needed to achieve a ceasefire and promote the initiation of a political dialogue. France calls on the federal government, the regional government of Tigray, and its allies to immediately give concrete signs of their openness to dialogue. The parties must immediately cease hostilities, freeze the positions of their forces, refrain from internationalizing the conflict, and agree on a gradual withdrawal to pre-conflict positions. France calls on the Ethiopian authorities to withdraw the designation of the TPLF as a terrorist organization in order to urgently start negotiations. The regional government of Tigray must recognize that the future of the Tigrayan region can only be determined through inclusive national dialogue and within the framework of the provisions of the Constitution. This also applies to the border dispute with the Amhara region. All parties must support the efforts of the African Union, President Obasanjo, and Kenya. Each of them has expressed their deep concern over the stability and unity of Ethiopia and the region, but also the hope that a dialogue could finally silence the guns. France supports these steps, as does the Secretary General of the United Nations and Ethiopia's main partners, including the EU. This council has also spoken out unanimously in support of their efforts. All of those statements reiterated the international community's commitment to the unity and territorial integrity of Ethiopia. Stakeholders in the region who exploit any vulnerabilities that the conflict has exacerbated will be held accountable. France reiterates its call for a definitive and verified withdrawal of the Eritrean forces. The international community is therefore united and mobilized to support peace efforts and provide international guarantees to overcome mistrust. We encourage the parties to seize this opportunity. It is more necessary than ever for all parties to respect international humanitarian law and human rights law. The protection of civilians must remain the top priority. The outbreak of fighting in urban areas increases the risk to populations. France is concerned about the violence, forced displacement, and hate speech targeting the ethnic origin of the victims. It calls on all parties to put an end to this violence, to fight the impunity of its perpetrators, and to act responsibly. France takes notes of the publication of the report on the joint investigation of the OHCHR and the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission. It expects all parties to initiate credible investigations into the alleged facts. These facts are extremely serious, in particular the extrajudicial killings and the numerous cases of sexual violence. The parties must ensure full access for all humanitarian, medical, and United Nations personnel. Blocking the delivery of medical aid is unacceptable. We hope that these obstacles will be lifted swiftly. Finally, France calls on the parties to guarantee access to prisoners and to initiate discussions with a view to their release. Thank you.
I thank the representative of France for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of India.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me join others in thanking High Representative of the Chairperson of the African Union Commission, His Excellency Obasanjo, and Undersecretary General for Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo, for updating this Council on the recent developments in the northern parts of Ethiopia. I also welcome the presence of Permanent Representative of Ethiopia, Ambassador Thai Selassie, in today's briefing. The conflict in northern parts of Ethiopia has seen escalation in the recent weeks and is threatening to expand towards the central parts of Ethiopia. The fighting has intensified and humanitarian situation has worsened, adversely affecting millions, particularly women, children, and elderly. It is concerning to note that the humanitarian efforts led by the UN has been stalled in the recent weeks. It is important that humanitarian assistance is resumed at the earliest available opportunity. We also reiterate the importance of founding principles of humanitarian assistance, that is humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. We have noted the report of the Joint Investigation Team of the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission and the OHCHR. We also note and welcome the recognition and acceptance of the report by the Ethiopian government as an important document that could complement ongoing efforts by the Ethiopian government to address the allegations of human rights violations and abuses. We further note that the report could not confirm deliberate or willful denial of humanitarian assistance to the civilian population in Tigray or the use of starvation as a weapon of war. The Ethiopian government has announced state of emergency in response to persisting conflict and expansion of violence beyond the Tigray region. The inclusive national dialogue announced on October 4th has not moved forward. Military offensive may not help in the resolution of the crisis, and inevitably there has to be a dialogue. India has consistently underscored the importance of mutual trust, engagement, dialogue, and reconciliation to address all issues related to the ongoing conflict. We therefore call upon all stakeholders to seize the opportunity provided by the mediation efforts of the African Union High Representative for the Horn of Africa region, His Excellency Obasanjo, purposefully. We welcome his meeting with the Prime Minister of Ethiopia and take note of his visit to Mekelle. He has also briefed AUPSC today morning. We also welcome the engagement of countries from the region in this process. We urge all sides to exercise restraint and work together to build trust and confidence that could pave way for dialogue. The political and economic stability of Ethiopia is paramount, not just to the Horn of Africa, but the entire African continent. It is in the interest of the region that the current politico-military situation is resolved within the constitutional framework of Ethiopia. In this regard, we support the initiatives of the African Union. It is important that regional initiatives led by the African Union are encouraged and actively supported by the Council. To conclude, India reiterates its strong commitment to the unity, sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Ethiopia. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of India for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Estonia.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Undersecretary General Di Carlo and High Representative Obasanjo for their briefings. Estonia is deeply concerned about the recent escalation in northern Ethiopia. These developments continue to cause civilian casualties and prolong human suffering and risk the stability of the country and the whole region. We call upon the TPLF to withdraw its troops from Amhara and Afar and the government of Ethiopia to refrain from airstrikes on civilian targets. All parties must do their utmost to protect civilians, including humanitarian and medical workers, in line with their obligations under international humanitarian law. There is no military solution to this conflict. We call upon all parties to immediately end hostilities without preconditions, engage in negotiations for a lasting ceasefire, and to create conditions for the start of a political dialogue. In this context, we would also like to express our full support to the international and regional efforts in achieving a peaceful resolution to the conflict. We encourage the continued engagement of the African Union and support the mediation efforts by the Special Representative Obasanjo. Mr. President, the deteriorating humanitarian crisis in Tigray, Amhara, and Afar regions is deeply worrying, as more and more people are in need of urgent assistance. All parties to the conflict have an obligation to facilitate safe and unhindered humanitarian access to all areas affected by conflict. It is also essential to restore basic services and the entry of fuel, cash, and humanitarian supplies needed for aid operations. We reiterate our deep concern about reported human rights violations and abuses, including widespread sexual and gender-based violence. We welcome the publication of the joint report by the OHCHR and Ethiopian Human Rights Commission. We call for full implementation of the recommendations of the report and for ensuring accountability for the perpetrators. It is now up to the Ethiopian government to carry out its promises on this. In conclusion, I would like to express deep regret that 1 year after the start of the conflict, the situation in northern Ethiopia has only deteriorated, with expanded hostilities, mounting deaths, and suffering of civilians, and a catastrophic humanitarian situation. In order to preserve the stability, unity, and territorial integrity of Ethiopia, all sides must cease the hostilities and solve their differences through a genuine and inclusive national dialogue. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Estonia for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. And let me start by recognizing and thanking the Council for getting out the statement last Friday that called for a ceasefire and expressed our strong concerns about the situation in Ethiopia. Thank you, Undersecretary General Di Carlo, for your briefing. And thank you to African Union High Representative Obasanjo for your briefing, and very specifically for your on-the-ground reports and efforts in the region. We strongly urge all parties to support and cooperate with you as you work to bring peace and stability to the region. The conflict in Ethiopia has now been going on for a full year, And this is a tremendously sad milestone. And as my Irish colleague stated, we really remained silent for too long. Over the past year, we have seen constant violence. We've witnessed widespread human rights abuses and atrocities. We've seen credible, documented, and persistent reports from a wide range of sources of looting, displacement, extrajudicial executions, rape, and sexual violence as weapons of war. And we've seen the threat of mass famine loom large as humanitarian aid and medical supplies are delayed and denied from going to civilians who need it most. The Joint UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission report details all of this very clearly. It makes it plain that there have been many human rights violations and abuses. And it demonstrates that the Ethiopian National Defense Forces, the Eritrean Defense Forces, the Amhara Special Forces, and the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front are all culpable. There are no good guys here. There are only victims on all sides. This vital report was limited in geography and chronology. Both should be expanded to ensure more recent allegations from across the region can be investigated and perpetrators held accountable. In the meantime, the violations and abuses documented cannot be tolerated. Suspected individuals need to be removed from active duty pending investigation. Independent bodies must be allowed to investigate and ensure accountability. Humanitarians must be allowed unimpeded access, and the violence must stop. This is not the Ethiopia that we thought we would see 2 years earlier, when we were applauding this country as the fastest growing economy in Africa. The unity and integrity of the Ethiopian state faces an existential threat from within, and millions of innocent civilians are at risk as the conflict expands and warring parties advance toward Addis. Mr. President, colleagues, it is time for all parties to immediately halt hostilities and refrain from incitement to violence and divisiveness. The bellicose rhetoric and inflammatory language on all sides of this conflict only aggravate intercommunal violence. It is time for the government of Ethiopia, the TPLF, and all other groups to engage in immediate ceasefire negotiations without preconditions to find a sustainable path toward peace. And it is long past time for the Eritrean Defense Forces to withdraw from Ethiopian territory. It is time to put your weapons down. And let me repeat that. It is time to put your weapons down. This war between angry, belligerent men victimizing women and children has to stop. As we call for peace, I want to address some critics who have said that the United States is biased toward one side of the conflict. Let me be crystal clear. We condemn violence on all sides. We condemn any and all human rights violations and abuses committed by all sides. So we condemn the violence by the ENDF and the Eritrean Defense Forces, and we condemn the TPLF's violence. We condemn the TPLF's expansion of war outside of Tigray. The TPLF must withdraw from Afar and Amhara. And we call on the TPLF and the Oromo Liberation Army to immediately stop the current advance toward Addis. We also call on the Ethiopian government to respect international humanitarian law. We're not taking sides. Innocent people, innocent Ethiopians are starving in northern Ethiopia. Withholding food and medical supplies is not acceptable. It is not an acceptable tactic at any time. And frankly, it's unconscionable and not what we would expect from Ethiopia. The Ethiopian government must allow UN agencies and their partners to staff Their operations with the specialized expertise required to mount an effective response. The reckless expulsion of UN officials are an affront to the United Nations and to the people of Ethiopia. The Ethiopian government must also investigate the terrible killings of humanitarian and human rights workers and hold those responsible to account. And it must cease all arbitrary detentions and ethnic targeting in Addis. Given the nationwide state of emergency, we are concerned about the safety of US citizens, US government personnel and their dependents, and the security of our facilities remain paramount. We will do everything in our power to keep our people safe, but we also ask that the state of emergency not be used as a pretense to attack civilians. We know, and you all know, the only solution to this conflict is a political solution. To that end, the African Union has an important role in resolving this conflict and sustaining regional peace and security. And I wish to thank President Obasanjo again for his efforts. Similarly, we support Kenyan President Kenyatta's November 3rd call for all parties to return to political negotiations, and also his efforts in this regard. Ultimately, the only ones who can bring lasting peace to Ethiopia are its leaders and its people. Only a wider dialogue about the future of their state, where all of Ethiopia's people are represented, can lead to broader democratic and economic renewal. It is never too late for peace, but the longer this conflict goes on, the harder the road to peace becomes, and the more people will die. And as you heard from High Representative Obasanjo, the window of opportunity is limited and time is running out. I urge all parties in the strongest possible terms to back away from the brink and lead their people toward peace, and to resume the development agenda that will lead to prosperity for all Ethiopians. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Mr. President, we have listened carefully to the information provided by the High Representative of the Chairperson of the African Union for the Horn of Africa, Olusegun Obasanjo, as well as UN Undersecretary General for Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, Rosemary DiCarlo, regarding the latest developments in the situation in northern Ethiopia. We welcome the participation in today's meeting of the country's permanent representative to the UN. The Russian Federation has been watching with concern as the situation develops in the Ethiopian regions of Tigray, Afar, and Amhara, where clashes have been taking place between government forces and units of the Tigray Defense Forces, as well as other groups that have joined them, including from the Oromo Liberation Army. Fighting around the cities of Dessa and Kombolchi last week clearly showed that a continuation of violence will lead to new casualties and dire humanitarian consequences for civilians. Of particular concern is the ongoing deterioration of the humanitarian situation in the areas affected by the hostilities. In Dessa and Kombolchi, where a significant number of refugees and IDPs lived even before the conflict, the clashes have led to a rapid rise in the number of refugees and internally displaced persons. Due to ongoing attacks by the TPLF, the total number of civilians in need of humanitarian assistance has already reached 7 million. Humanitarian aid to all regions of the country must be increased. We continue with the sovereign government and in strict accordance with the basic guiding principles of the United Nations. Mr. President, as we have said before, the divisions in Ethiopia run deep and have a complex historical context. Moreover, what is happening in the country carries significant negative potential for the entire region. In this regard, throughout all of these months, we have called for stakeholders with influence to bear on the situation, as well as the media, to act responsibly, to avoid ratcheting up international rhetoric, and refrain from adding fuel to the fire of the already spiraling interethnic strife. We are convinced also that imposing legal unilateral sanctions, threatening to use such sanctions, and refusal to provide economic assistance are very counterproductive and will only worsen the situation for ordinary people who are already suffering rather than reconciliation. There is no other way to resolve the conflict except to support national and regional efforts to end the intra-Ethiopian military confrontation and establish a dialogue with the aim of restoring peace and achieving gradual socioeconomic stabilization throughout the country. At various points in history, Ethiopians have repeatedly demonstrated their ability to live in interethnic harmony and build a common state. This was confirmed by the peaceful and democratic general elections held this year. The high level of support for the country's government was also demonstrated by recent mass protests in Addis Ababa. Mr. President, we're aware of the various mediation efforts recently undertaken by the UN and the African Union. Unfortunately, as the situation on the ground shows, they have not yet yielded significant results. In this regard, Mr. Obasanjo, we hope that you, as an honest and impartial broker, will take the necessary urgent steps to reverse the momentum in the direction of peace. All the necessary signals from the Security Council were sent in its press statement adopted on November 5th. We also welcome the work carried out in the region by the head of the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, Martin Griffiths, that these efforts will generate momentum for the work of humanitarian personnel on the ground, including in terms of providing uninterrupted humanitarian assistance. In conclusion, we wish to reaffirm our commitment to preserving the unity and territorial integrity of friendly Ethiopia. We are convinced that there can be no other basis for resolving all outstanding contentious issues. Thank you for your attention.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for her statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of Mexico. I would, of course, like to thank USG Rosemary DiCarlo and Mr. Obasanjo for their very enlightening briefings. We have convened this meeting as a result of our deep concern about the situation in Ethiopia, the advance of the Tigray People's Liberation Front, the mobilization of the Oromo Liberation Army, and the continued aerial bombardments by the Ethiopian army in Mekele represent an exponential escalation of the hostilities, whose effects are now spreading also to the regions of Amhara and Afar. The Ethiopian government's recent decision to declare a state of emergency clearly shows that if the parties persist in the military option, then the conflict will spread to the entire country and will have serious consequences, not just for the people of Ethiopia who are suffering them, but also for the entire region. That is why we support and encourage regional efforts to find a solution, a negotiated solution to the crisis, particularly those undertaken by the Special Envoy of the African Union for the Horn of Africa, former President Obasanjo. In the humanitarian domain, we are concerned to see that the aerial attacks in Mekele have already compelled the UN to suspend its flights to that city. This has cut off the entry of cash and humanitarian personnel, worsening, therefore, the living conditions for civilians. We are concerned that although food and essentials are available for the people of Tigray, they can't actually be delivered because of the lack of fuel and money to pay the contractors. The Ethiopian government needs to provide security guarantees so that at the very least the 2 weekly flights which had been operating until a few weeks ago to Mekele can resume. All the parties must fulfill their obligations under international humanitarian law. There must be unfettered access for humanitarian aid without further delay. Mexico also takes note of the report on investigation of the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission and the OHCHR. This reports attacks on civilians, extrajudicial executions, torture, and enforced disappearances, sexual and gender-based violence, the enforced displacement of civilians, denying access to humanitarian aid, the arrest and intimidation of journalists, inter alia. These violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law by all to the conflict must be investigated and punished. In this context, my delegation reiterates this Council's call to all parties to reach a ceasefire and for the conditions to be established for a national dialogue. Negotiations must begin immediately and without preconditions. Mexico deeply regrets the fact that, in spite of the indications of the destructive potential of the conflict and the repeated warnings by UN agencies about the seriousness of the humanitarian situation, the Security Council has not been able to avoid this conflict escalating. We are deeply concerned to see the use of bellicose rhetoric that stirs up animosity between ethnic groups. We know where the manipulation of hate speech can lead in such a diverse country, but we trust that this Council will have learnt from the mistakes of the past and will be able to shoulder this time its responsibility to facilitate a political process that will lead to peace in Ethiopia. I now resume my function as President of the Council, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ethiopia. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President, for giving the floor and for allowing the participation of my country in this briefing. I also congratulate you on Mexico's presidencies of the Council for the month of November. I recognize the presence of His Excellency President Obasanjo, High Representative of the African Union to the Horn of Africa, and Under Secretary General Rosemary DiCarlo. I thank both for their briefing. Mr. President, a year ago, the Northern Command of the Ethiopian National Defense Force was attacked within. The unsuspecting men and women in uniform were slain in the dark hours of November 4, 2020. The long-standing service and sacrifice of the National Defense Forces is rewarded by unprecedented level of betrayal and treasonous attack waged by TPLF. Ethiopia will never forget the patriots and their service and sacrifice. The day will also go down as the day of infamy in Ethiopia's proud history. In this connection, I would like to extend our thanks to members of this council who stood with my country during this very trying year. Mr. President, in the past year, we reversed the military threat posed by TPLF. In parallel, we made all efforts to provide food and non-food items to people in need in Tigray. We signed a humanitarian assistance agreement with the United Nations. We spent close to 100 million for assistance and reconstruction. We declared humanitarian ceasefire and withdraw our forces. And we implored the treasonous group to hand over leaders of its criminal scheme and leave its rank and file members to live in peace. All this is proven to be in vain. It didn't help us gain peace. Today, I will not provide you details on the humanitarian assistance we delivered to our people in need. As a result of the continued and now widespread criminal belligerence of TPLF, the people of Tigray that needed urgent humanitarian assistance are not having any aid delivered. The people in Afar and Amara regions are rendered vulnerable. Cities and towns are shelled. Residents are killed in their doorsteps and robbed their earnings from their toil. True to its unscrupulous and cruel nature, TPLF is causing terror and mayhem. As we speak, Ethiopians in the northern part of the country are fending for their life and the life of their children. The trucks we sent to Tigray with food and medical supplies are transporting weapons and use combatants that are frauded or forced to fight against their brothers and sisters for no apparent public interest, but for the greedy driven political agenda of a few individuals. Excellencies, we honor and respect the call for political dialogue. It is an approach we fully prescribe to and even applied in resolving many interested and interstate disputes. Inherently, our current situation is not any different. There is a deep-seated political difference and grievances in our nascent democracy. We are also a diverse nation and a home to 83 languages and many groups than headlines care to mention with unaddressed legitimate questions and demands. However, no political group, despite their grievances, have raised an arm against their brethren. No ethnic or political group, despite its unfulfilled demands, have waged war against the motherland. Diversity is not Ethiopia's problem. Our challenge is not, as some reluctantly posit, a failure to manage diversity. Diversity is Ethiopia's asset. Our problem is a criminal group that refuses to accept equality and let go ill-gained supremacy and privilege. Unfortunately, this group garners support from many sources. Some media outlets in the West, some staff members and leaders of international organizations openly support the group. For your surprise, we sometimes learn the motives and the next steps of the group from statements and speeches of high-placed officials of these entities. As you may recall, even this council was made to convene over a false report alleging heinous crimes, including the use of hunger as a weapon of war. Thankfully, truth has come out, and these malicious accusations are dispelled by a joint investigation report of the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission and the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Our plea for members of the international community, states and non-state actors to refrain from providing moral and material support went unheeded. TPLF is emboldened and numbed itself to an extent it stopped counting the lives of Ethiopians from Tigray, its sacrifice on its hopeless journey. It is emboldened to a level it threatens to unseat a popularly elected federal government and destabilize a nation of 112 million people. We again reiterate our plea for the support of this group that have been providing it with communication equipment, satellite information, weapons, and even fighters to desist from this. It is not only illegal, but also an immoral act. Mr. President, Ethiopia is pained. What we have gone through at the hands of this criminal group will require intergenerational effort to heal. For this, Ethiopia needs its children to dialogue and reconcile. We have time and again expressed our readiness and explained the preparation for national political dialogue. Had it not been for the shed caused by the TPLF, even the political future of this group would have had a prospect of resolution through dialogue. In line with our commitment, we entertain the efforts for support and undertook the work with all our friends to learn from their experience and draw the available and relevant lesson and support. We accepted the High Representative of the African Union to the Horn of Africa and assist his role. We believe the regional solution is best placed to support us get out of this problem. This being said, our route to a dialogue and political solution will not be straightforward or easy. For now, we are focused on halting the TPLF and rescuing and reaching our public that suffered immensely under its cruel and deceptive methods. In this regard, we remind everyone concerned there are no two parties here. There is a government representing the whole of the Ethiopian people and representing the Ethiopian state, and there is a group advancing its criminal cause through atrocities. Any attempt, including the media campaign we have been witnessing in the past few days to launder the TPLF and diminish the horror it committed against the Ethiopian people will only be counterproductive. Mr. President, what exalts my country as a nation is to overcome its own challenges. What may raise us as a country is the commitment of all Ethiopians to bring peace and stability. What is needed is well-meant insight and forethought and support. Statements of marginalization, sanctions, punitive measures will not help, or rather counterproductive. Out of our conviction to peaceful solution to all disputes, we will keep engaging all well-meaning actors, the AU High Representative and regional leaders. In the course of this process, we hope we have the understanding of this council and its membership. I would like to assure you, the council member, that my country will prevail as it did in the past in the face of all its adversities. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Ethiopia for his statement. I would now like to ask our briefers if they have any additional comments to make. I don't have any other name inscribed on my list. That seems not to be the case. So I would now therefore like to invite council members to informal consultations to continue our discussion on the subject. The meeting stands adjourned.
Does that mean that we finished?